The Imperial Galactic Overwatch Council of the Known Universe. The shuttle door opened and I felt the cold hit me first. Not the cold of space, I had trained for that. This was something else. It was the cold of being watched by 100 different kinds of eyes, none of them blinking the way human eyes do, none of them carrying anything close to warmth. I stepped out onto the receiving platform of the Grand Conclave station and I told myself to breathe. Just breathe. My name is Yara Solis. I was 41 years old, I had 2 engineering degrees, a background in flood zone crisis management, and absolutely zero experience in galactic diplomacy. I was not the first choice for this position. I was not the second choice either. The diplomat who was supposed to be standing in my shoes was a man named Calvin Hurst, a decorated career negotiator who had spent 20 years preparing for this exact moment. When the Vethari delegation ran their standard pre-arrival telepathic compatibility scan on him, his body responded with complete neurological shutdown. He survived. He was still in recovery. The scan found nothing threatening inside Calvin's mind. His body simply had not been ready for something that large touching it. They scanned me next. I felt it, like someone pressed a warm hand flat against the inside of my skull. I did not freeze. I looked at the Vethari technician and said, quietly, that they could continue. They stopped the scan early, which I later learned no new arrival had ever caused them to do. They did not explain why. I was cleared within 6 minutes and given the title Ambassador-elect, which on Earth sounded important and inside the station meant almost nothing at all. The platform I stood on was the size of 4 football fields. It extended from the outer hull of the station like a tongue. The station itself was larger than Earth's moon. I had seen the photographs, had studied the schematics for months, but no photograph prepares you for the actual weight of a structure that size existing in front of you. It bends something in your thinking. Your brain, trained on a planet of a certain scale, simply does not have the right tools to process it. I stood there for 3 full seconds just absorbing the fact that I was here, and then I picked up my bag and kept walking. A Vethari official named Coordinator Yelvath met me at the end of the platform. The Vethari were tall and thin, with pale silver skin and long fingers that seemed to have one extra joint than was strictly necessary. Yelvath had 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal line across his face, and when he looked at me, all 4 focused at the same moment. It was disconcerting. I had been told it would be. I looked directly back at him and smiled, because a human smile, I had read, registered as non-threatening across 43 of the 81 known species, which was not a majority but was a better opening number than no smile at all. Yelvath did not smile back. What he did was tilt his head at a precise angle and say, in translation perfect English that my earpiece confirmed was accurate, that he hoped I had rested well during my transit. It was the standard greeting. A formality. Then he paused, and in that pause there was something else. Something that had a texture to it, like a person choosing their words to be technically true while carrying a completely different meaning underneath. He said, "Your species is charmingly reactive. It will be interesting to observe how that quality translates in a formal council environment." Charmingly reactive. I let the words sit in the air for a moment. Not because I did not know what to say, but because I had learned, long before this moment, in a flooded district outside of Lagos when I was 26 and trying to explain to a government ministry why their levy plan was going to fail, that the most powerful thing you can do in response to condescension is to take your time with it. I looked at Yelvath and said, "I suppose we will find out together." He blinked all 4 eyes at once. I did not know yet what that meant in Vethari body language. I filed it away. They gave me a room that was clearly designed for a species much taller than me. Everything was at the wrong height. The surfaces were smooth and pale, the light was blue-white, and the sleeping platform was elevated in a way that required me to climb. I did not complain about any of it. I put my bag down, I sat on the edge of the too-tall platform, and I opened the council charter for the first time. The charter was 1140 pages long in its original form. The translation into English was slightly longer because some galactic common concepts required entire sentences to approximate in human language. It was, without question, the most dense and boring document I had ever attempted to read. I read every word. I did not read it because I was disciplined. I read it because I was scared, and reading was what I did when I was scared. It was what I had always done. When my grandmother's district flooded for the third time and the government sent a 60-page technical report instead of actual help, I had read every page of that too. I found the clause that allowed independent engineers to submit counter-assessments. I submitted one. It took 14 months, but the levee was eventually redesigned. Not by me, I was too young and too unknown. But because of what I found in those 60 pages, it happened. I read the council charter through the night. The station's lighting system cycled through what I assumed was a simulated day cycle, dimming and brightening at intervals that did not match any Earth clock I knew. I drank 3 cups of something that the station's food system had produced in response to my request for coffee. It was not coffee. It was, however, warm and slightly bitter, and it kept me awake, so I accepted it. By the time the light brightened again to indicate morning, I had finished the charter. I had also found 3 things that the drafting species had clearly not intended to be found. The first was a procedural pathway, buried in Article 44, subsection 9, that allowed any delegation, regardless of membership status, to call for a formal status review of another delegation, provided they could demonstrate that the current classification contradicted 3 or more stated principles from the Charter's preamble. Humanity had been classified as an observed primitive civilization for 40 years. The preamble contained 7 principles. I had already matched 4 of them to points that humanity clearly, demonstrably exceeded. The second was a co-signature rule. Any motion required only 2 supporting signatures from full member delegations to survive a procedural challenge. Most new ambassadors spent years cultivating allies before attempting anything. I did not have years. The third thing I found was stranger. Buried in the translation notes of Article 1 was a line that had apparently never been formally challenged. It stated that ward species, the lowest classification, which humanity held, had no voting rights but were not explicitly barred from speaking rights during open floor sessions. No one had ever used this because ward species were culturally expected to remain silent. Expected was not the same as required. I closed the charter at sunrise. I had not slept. I was not tired. I was something else, the feeling that comes when you realize a problem you thought was enormous is actually a problem with a specific shape, and you have just found the outline of it. I opened my notebook and began writing. The first session of the Galactic Council's current cycle was scheduled for 3 days from my arrival. It was called a convening of record, which meant no votes were expected, no formal motions were on the table. It was ceremonial. Every new delegate attended it as an observer. You were supposed to sit, absorb the gravity of the setting, and be appropriately humbled. I spent those 3 days doing 2 things. I reread every article I had flagged, and I introduced myself to as many other delegates as I could find. Not the senior ones. I was not ready for that yet. I introduced myself to the junior Atticus, the secondary translators, the administrative staff. I asked them about their food customs. I learned 6 words in 3 different galactic languages, all of them greetings, and I used them correctly and without showing off, because using a greeting in someone's language was a gesture, but making a production of it was just performance. I also met, briefly, a delegate from a species called the Anari, a small, quiet people who communicated partly through color shifts in their skin. Their name was Delegate Pell, and they were the most junior representative of the most ignored species on the council. When I introduced myself, Pell's skin shifted to a pale gold, which I learned later was their equivalent of cautious surprise. They had never had a human speak to them directly. I told Pell I had read the charter. Pell's skin went very still. They asked, in halting translation English, what I had thought of it. I said I thought it was a document that had been written by powerful species to govern less powerful ones and had done its job very well for a very long time, but that documents like that tended to contain, if you read carefully, the seeds of their own reform. Pell looked at me for a long time. Then they asked if I would like to have something like tea together before the first session. I said yes. The first convening was held in a chamber the size of a sports stadium. 81 species. The air was managed to be breathable for all of them simultaneously, which created an atmosphere that was slightly too thick and tasted faintly of metal. The seats were tiered in a circle, and in the center was a raised platform where the council's 5 founder delegates Saturday the founders were the oldest member species. They had built this station. They had written the charter. Their chairs were elevated just enough above the others to make the point without stating it. I sat in the human delegation seat. It was on the outer ring, the farthest from the center. It had no name placard. It had a small marker that read, "In Galactic Common, Earth Ward." I looked at it for a moment. Then I took out a pen and wrote beneath it, in English, my name. The ceremony began. There were ritual invocations in the Galactic Common tongue, which my earpiece translated with a slight delay. The founder delegates spoke in sequence, offering formal acknowledgments of the cycle's beginning. It was beautiful, in the way that very old things are beautiful. You could feel the weight of the years behind every word. It also took 4 hours. I sat through all of it without fidgeting, which I will say was one of the harder things I have ever done. At the end of the 4 hours, the presiding founder, a Vethari elder whose title translated to something like Voice of Origins, raised a ceremonial instrument to signal the session's close. Before the sound finished, I was on my feet. "I would like to raise a procedural matter," I said. My earpiece translated it simultaneously into Galactic Common. The sound of my voice carrying through the chamber's speakers, in a language none of these species had expected to hear from the outer ring, caused a reaction I can only describe as a held breath. 81 species breathing in and not releasing. The Voice of Origins looked at me. All 4 of his eyes focused. Beside him, Coordinator Yelvath, sitting in an observer role, went very still. I cited Article 44, subsection 9. I stated humanity's case in 4 sentences. I named 2 co-signers, Delegate Pell of the Anari, and a secondary delegate from a species called the Vor, whose own status review had been pending for 60 years. I placed the motion formally on record and sat back down. The chamber did not explode. It hummed. It was the sound of 81 different kinds of minds processing something they had not anticipated. Yelvath looked at me from across the room. I could not read all 4 of his eyes at once. But I caught something in the set of his posture, the particular quality of someone who has just realized that what they thought was a guest is something else entirely. I looked down at my notebook. I had 11 more motions prepared. I was going to need all of them. In my 31 years of life, nobody had ever handed me anything without first making sure I understood how heavy the debt would be. That is not bitterness. That is just the record. So when I tell you that my first real ally inside the Grand Conclave Station was not a human, was not even a species that had ever looked at Earth with anything approaching curiosity, you have to understand that I was not prepared for it. The archivist found me the morning after the first session. I was in the corridor outside my quarters, sitting cross-legged on the floor against the wall because the room's furniture still did not fit me properly and the floor was at least a consistent height. I was eating something from a sealed ration packet that Earth's Transit Authority had packed for me, reading through my notes on the Vethari procedural countermanuals. The archivist stopped in front of me and did not speak immediately. This was, I later learned, standard for his species. The Korvathi did not begin conversations. They arrived and waited for you to notice them. I noticed him. It would have been difficult not to. The Korvathi were large, not tall exactly, but volumetrically significant in the way that a boulder is significant. The archivist had a dark gray outer shell that looked almost like stone but moved with him like a second skin. His speaking apparatus was located somewhere below what I might loosely call his head, and when he spoke it was a low vibration that I felt in my chest before my earpiece converted it into words. He said, "You read the entire charter." It was not a question. I told him yes. He said, "No new arrival has done that in 6,214 years." I asked him how he knew. He said, "Because I was here 6,214 years ago when the last one did." It was a species called the Methae. They are not a member species anymore. I stopped eating. I asked what happened to them. The archivist was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They asked too many questions in the wrong rooms. But you should know that they were not wrong. They were simply not careful." He lowered his bulk until he was closer to my level, which I appreciated more than I showed. He looked at me with his 2 wide, flat eyes that did not appear to have any iris at all, just a deep uniform gray that matched his shell. He said, "You cited Article 44, subsection 9, correctly. The motion is on record. The Vethari Countercommittee will attempt to bury it by the 4th session. They will use Article 61, the Administrative Deferment Clause. You have approximately 9 days. I asked him why he was telling me this. He said, because I have been the archivist for a very long time. I have watched things go wrong in ways that were preventable. I am not permitted to intervene. I am permitted to observe. And occasionally, when observation leads to conversation, I find that the line between the two is less clear than the charter implies. I smiled at him. He did not smile back because his species did not have the facial range for it, but something in his posture shifted. I had come to think of it as his version of warmth. I asked him who the 5 founders were, not their names, which I knew, but what they actually cared about, what they were protective of, what they would move quickly to defend. The archivist began to talk. He talked for 2 hours. I wrote down everything. By the end of it, I understood something that no briefing document Earth had given me had come close to explaining. The 5 founders were not simply powerful. They were old in a way that had curdled, the way anything left too long in one position begins to stop believing that other positions are possible. They had built this council because they genuinely believed in order. They still believed in it. But over thousands of years, their idea of order had quietly become identical to their idea of themselves. They could not see the difference anymore. The archivist left without ceremony. He simply stopped talking and began walking. I stayed on the floor of the corridor and looked at my notes. I thought about my grandmother. Her name was Nadia Solis, and she had been born in a part of the world where the idea of official help arriving in time was largely theoretical. She had built the first functional drainage barrier in her district with salvaged pipe and 3 weeks of voluntary labor from her neighbors. When the government inspector arrived to assess it, he told her it was not up to code. She asked him which code. He showed her the manual. She read it that evening. The next morning she showed him 4 specific clauses that her barrier met and 1 modification she could make to satisfy the 5th. He stamped it approved. He looked unhappy about it. She looked satisfied in the way that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with getting the actual job done. I thought about that a lot in my early weeks on the station. The council operated on a schedule that would have paralyzed any human institution. Sessions were long and formal. The space between formal sessions was filled with an elaborate system of committee meetings, subcommittee consultations, review boards, and what the Galactic Common Tongue described as deliberative pauses, which were scheduled silences built into the calendar for the purpose of reflection. I attended every meeting I was permitted to attend. I said very little in most of them. I listened with the particular kind of attention that looks like patience but is actually information gathering. I learned, in those early weeks, who mattered and why, and also who thought they mattered and why that was different. I learned which council species communicated primarily through sound and which through posture. I learned that the SOVF, one of the 5 founders, a crystalline species with a lifespan measured in geological epochs, communicated displeasure by changing the refraction angle of their outer facets very slightly. Most delegates never noticed. I started noticing on day 12. The motion I had placed in the first session was, as the archivist had predicted, buried. It happened on the 8th day, through a procedural mechanism so subtle that I almost missed it. A Vethari Council secretary submitted an administrative reclassification request that moved humanity's status review from the active docket to the review pending archive, citing an Article 61 provision about insufficient documentation. It was legal. It was precise. And it was done without any public announcement, on a day when 3 other motions were being loudly debated, giving every other delegate something else to look at. I saw it happen because I had been watching the administrative filing board every morning since I arrived. I had set up a translation alert for any filing that referenced the words Earth, human, or soul system. The alert came through while I was at a subcommittee session on interstellar trade tariffs that I had not been invited to but that ward species were not explicitly barred from attending. I did not react. I made a note. I kept listening to the tariff discussion, because the tariff discussion was also interesting, and because reacting immediately was how you let the other party know exactly how much something had cost you. That evening I sent a formal message to the council secretary requesting clarification on the documentation requirements for Article 44 status reviews. The message was polite and precise and required a formal response within 7 days under council procedure. While the Vethari secretarial staff composed their response, I filed a secondary motion under a different article entirely, Article 22, which covered the rights of non-voting delegations to petition for procedural transparency. It was a smaller motion. It asked nothing dramatic. It simply required that any administrative action affecting a delegation's docket status be posted to the public record within 48 hours. It was, by itself, nearly harmless. But Article 22 motions did not require full member co-signatures. They only required 2 supporting attestations from any recognized council attendees, including ward species. Delegate Pell of the Anari signed within an hour of receiving my message. A delegate from a species called the Harith, small, fast-moving creatures who communicated through a combination of chirping sounds and rapid fin movements and had been ward classified for 90 years, signed the next morning. By the time the Vethari secretarial staff finished composing their response to my first message, the Article 22 motion was already on record and had been acknowledged by the administrative office. Coordinator Yelvath appeared at my door that afternoon. He did not barge in. He stood in the doorway and waited, which I had learned was considered polite in Vethari custom. I looked up from my desk. All 4 of his eyes were focused on me with a precision that felt different from his earlier assessment of me on the arrival platform. That first look had been appraisal. This was something more alert. He said, "You are an engineer." I said yes. He said, "I reviewed your background file after the first session. Flood engineering. Infrastructure repair. 17 years of field work in damaged systems." I said yes. He said, "You see the council as a damaged system." I thought about that for a moment. I said no, not exactly. I said I saw the council as a system that had worked very well for a very long time and had therefore stopped questioning whether it was still working for everyone it was supposed to serve. I said that was not the same as damage. I said it was more like a building that had been built so solidly that no one had noticed the water level rising around the foundation. Yelvath was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, "Your Article 22 motion will be reviewed. The council will not obstruct a transparency motion openly. It would set a precedent they cannot afford." I said I knew. He said, "You are going to make this very difficult for everyone." I said, "I am going to make it accurate." He left. I went back to my notes. I had, at that point, been on the station for 22 days. The Article 22 motion passed 6 days later without a single objection, because objecting to transparency on record was something none of the founders were willing to do where the other 76 species could see it. It was a small thing. A procedural footnote. But it was the first thing humanity had ever passed in the Imperial Galactic Overwatch Council of the known universe. I called my contact at the Earth Diplomatic Bureau that evening and told them what had happened. There was a long silence on the line. Then my contact, a tired man named Gareth Cole who had been the Bureau's liaison to the station for 9 years and had never been invited inside it, said, "Yara, you have been here less than a month." I said, "I know." He said, "Are you being careful?" I looked at my 11 prepared motions. I looked at the notes from my 2 hours with the archivist. I looked at the list of ward species I had been slowly, quietly introducing myself to, one by one, in corridors and food halls and the margins of sessions. I said, "I am being very careful. I am being careful in a direction they have not thought to watch for." Gareth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't get buried." I told him I had read the charter. I knew exactly how the burial mechanism worked. What I did not say, because it was too early to say it and because I did not want to sound like someone who was already celebrating before the real work had begun, was what I had realized in those 22 days. The 5 founders had spent thousands of years building a system so sophisticated that no one could challenge it through direct confrontation. They were right about that. Direct confrontation would fail. It had always failed. The Methe had tried it. Others before them had tried it. But a system built to resist confrontation is not necessarily built to resist something slower. Something that does not push against the walls but instead learns where the walls are, which ones are structural, and which ones are simply there because no one ever asked why. I had found 3 of the second kind in my first night with the charter. I was going to find the rest. And I was going to do it while smiling politely at Coordinator Yelvath, drinking my not-quite coffee in the too bright corridor light, and making sure that every ward species delegate in this station knew that someone at the table had noticed them. The Drell crisis did not announce itself. That is how genuine crises tend to work. They do not arrive with warnings and formal notifications. They surface in the margins of things: a line item in a trade report, a phrase in a committee summary, a number in a resource allocation table that does not match the number from the previous quarter. I found it on a Tuesday. I had started labeling my days in Earth time because the station's cycle did not map cleanly to any schedule my body recognized, and maintaining a human calendar gave me something to hold onto when everything else around me was operating on geological or astronomical timescales. The line item was buried in the 43rd page of a SOVIET Trade Commission quarterly filing. It referenced a resource extraction operation in a system called DREL 4, listed under the category of unclaimed planetary resource sites. I knew that category. I had read the full glossary of the Charter's Resource Management Appendix 6 weeks earlier. Unclaimed planetary resource sites were, by Council definition, systems with no recognized sentient inhabitants. The DREL were sentient. They had been Ward classified for 80 years. They were small, quiet, and communicated through a combination of bioluminescent pattern shifts and subsonic vibration. They were not considered particularly impressive by galactic standards. They had never invented faster-than-light travel independently. They had been observed and documented and filed and forgotten in the way that the Council was very skilled at filing and forgetting things that did not generate conflict. But they were there. They were on DREL 4. And the SOVIET Trade Commission had filed them as absent. I read the line item 3 times. Then I read it again, because I have learned over the years that when you think you have found something that's serious, you owe it to the situation to make sure you have not made an error. I had not made an error. I found the archivist that afternoon in the records hall, which was where he spent most of his time, tending to the physical archives in a way that no digital system had been permitted to replace. He looked up when I entered and did not wait for me to speak. He said, "You found the DREL filing." I asked him how long he had known. He said, "I discovered the discrepancy 14 months ago." I asked him why nothing had been done. He said, "Because what can be done, within the current interpretation of Council law, is very limited. The SOVIET filing does not violate any article. It exploits a gap in Article 88, which governs the classification of inhabited worlds. The DREL were never upgraded from initial observation status. Initial observation status does not require the Council to treat the observed species as current inhabitants for the purpose of resource protection law. It is not right. It is legal." I sat down on a storage crate because the archivist's hall also had no furniture at human height. I looked at the rows of physical records stretching back farther than I could see and thought about what 14 months meant. 14 months of knowing and waiting and watching. I said, "Has anyone raised it in session?" He said, 3 delegations were aware of it. None raised it formally. I asked why. He said, "Because formally raising it requires either full member status to move a motion or a ward species to speak under open floor provisions, which no ward species has done in recorded history because the cultural expectation against it is older than the formal charter itself." I looked at him. He looked at me. I said, "The open floor provisions that allow speaking rights without voting rights." He said, "Which you identified in the charter on your first night here." "Yes." I said, "And which no one has ever used." He said, "Not in the modern period." I thought for a moment. Then I said, "Which means there is no established procedure for responding to it." The archivist was quiet. And then, slowly, he said, "The founders would need to create one. In real time. In front of every delegation in the chamber." I stood up from the storage crate. The session was in 4 days. A full convening of record, which meant all 81 delegations in attendance. It was scheduled as ceremonial, a mid-cycle acknowledgement. No motions on the agenda. No votes expected. It was exactly the kind of session where no one would be looking at the outer ring. I spent those 4 days moving quickly and quietly. I visited every ward species delegate I had spoken to in the previous weeks. I did not ask them to do anything they were not prepared to do. I asked them specific questions. I asked them if they had read Article 12, Section 4 of the Charter, which covered open floor speaking provisions. I asked them whether they had any matters they would like to place before the Council if the opportunity arose. 16 of them said yes. 2 said they needed to think about it. 1. A delegate from a species called the Phi, ancient, slow-moving beings who had been ward classified longer than most member species had existed, said something in their own language that my earpiece struggled with and then translated as approximately, "We have been waiting for someone to ask." I did not cry in front of the Phi delegate. I wanted to. I did not. The day before the session, Coordinator Yelvath appeared at my door again. This was becoming a pattern. I had started thinking of it as his version of checking whether the water level had risen. He said, "There are reports that you have been meeting with ward species delegations." I said yes. He said, "The founders will be monitoring the session closely." I said I expected they would. He said, "Ambassador Solis, what you are building will cause significant disruption to existing council structures." I said, "Coordinator Yelvath, the Drell have been on Drell 4 for 80 years under council observation. Their world is currently being classified as an unclaimed resource site in a SOVF trade filing. If the structures you are describing cannot accommodate that fact without being disrupted, then the problem is not what I am building." He looked at me for a long time. All four eyes. I had learned by then that when all four of Yelvath's eyes focused on you at the same time, it did not mean he was threatening you. It meant he was actually paying attention, fully, without the social filtering that most diplomatic interactions involved. It was his version of honesty. He said, "The SOVF elder will not yield easily." I said, "I know." He said, "You may not win this." I said, "I am not trying to win anything. I am trying to put something on the record that cannot be unfiled." Yelvath left. I closed my door and sat down and felt, for the first time since arriving on this station, the particular weight of knowing that tomorrow was going to be a day that either changed something or demonstrated very clearly why everything needed changing. I ate my ration packet. I drank my not coffee. I read through every note I had made in the past weeks and found nothing I had missed. The session began on time, which was unusual. The founder delegates took their elevated seats in the center of the chamber. The ceremony proceeded through its standard sequence: invocations, cycle acknowledgements, the formal silence. The presiding voice of Origins began the closing sequence. I was on my feet before he finished. But this time I was not alone. Across the chamber, in the outer ring, Delegate Pell of the Anari stood. So did the Harith delegate, 3 Phi representatives, 2 delegates from the Vor, and 9 others, species that had not spoken in this chamber in decades or ever. All of us standing, simultaneously, under open-floor provisions that the Council had never needed to respond to before, invoking speaking rights that were technically theirs but had never been exercised. The chamber did not hum this time. It went completely, absolutely silent in a way that I felt in my chest. The voice of Origins looked at us. All of us. His expression, filtered through the translation of his species' physical language, conveyed something I had not expected to see in a 5,000-year-old political body. Surprise. I spoke first because I had been the one to prepare the others, and it was right that I take the first measure of whatever reaction was coming. I stated the Drell situation in clear, simple language. I cited the exact article and subsection of the charter that required the Council to review the classification of any observed species when evidence of permanent habitation was presented. I presented the evidence, the SOVF filing, cross-referenced against the original Drell observation records from 80 years ago. I stated that under the charter's own provisions, the classification was an error that required correction. I sat down. Pell stood and spoke. The Harith delegate spoke. The Phi representative spoke, slowly and with the deep gravity of a species that had been silent for longer than most nations on Earth had existed. The chamber listened. The SOVF elder, sitting in the elevated center, changed the refraction angle of her outer facets. I had been watching for that. I noted it and kept my face still. What happened next was not a vote. A vote required a motion required a full member sponsor, and we had not provided one, because we did not need one. We had not asked the Council to vote. We had asked it to acknowledge what was already in its own records. After the ward species had finished speaking, the voice of Origin sat for a very long time without speaking. The chamber waited. This was not procedure. This was something older than procedure, the weight of something that has just been named out loud for the first time. The SOVF elder spoke. She said that the matter would require formal review by the Resource Classification Subcommittee. I stood again. I said that under Article 56, any matter raised under open floor provisions that cited active species observation records could not be referred to subcommittee without a full chamber vote on the referral itself. Article 56. I had found it on page 712 of the Charter. I had been waiting 4 months for the right moment to use it. The voice of Origins looked at me. The SOVF elder looked at me. Yelvath, sitting in his observer position, looked at me, and for a brief moment I thought I caught something in his expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. The referral vote was called. It failed. Not by much, but it failed. The Drell matter stayed on the main floor. 3 days later, after emergency consultations that kept every founder delegate in closed-door meetings for most of a standard Earth week, the Drell's observation status was formally suspended pending a reclassification review. The SOVF extraction operation was placed on hold. It was not a victory in the permanent sense. Nothing in this council was ever permanent in one move. But the Drell were still on Drell 4. The file had been corrected. What had been done in the margins had been pulled into the light. That was enough. For now, it was enough. Gareth Cole called me from Earth that night. He sounded like a man who had not slept, which matched how I felt. He said, 17 ward species. On their feet. Simultaneously. I said yes. He said, Yara, they are going to push back on this. Hard. I said, I know. I have been expecting it. He said, what are you going to do? I looked at my list of 11 motions, 8 of which I had still not used. I looked at my notes from the archivist. I looked at the list of ward species that had stood up today, and the 2 that had said they needed to think about it, and the 1 FI delegate who had said we have been waiting for someone to ask. I said, I'm going to do what my grandmother taught me to do. Gareth waited. I said, I am going to learn why it failed. And then I am going to fix it so it does not fail again. The pushback came faster than I expected and more organized than I had prepared for, which told me that the founders had been planning it longer than the Drell situation had been public. That was useful information. It meant they had known something was coming before I had shown my hand. It meant there was something in my movement through the station that had been legible to them, even when I thought I was being quiet. I spent the first morning of the pushback sitting very still and thinking about what I had allowed them to see. The answer, when I worked through it, was my network of ward species contacts. I had been careful not to be seen meeting with them in groups. I had been individually careful. But 17 species walking into a session prepared, on the same day, using the same procedural provisions, that told a story no single meeting could have told, because the coordination required to produce that result was visible in the result itself, even if the process had been invisible. They could not undo what had happened. The Drell matter was on record. But they could make sure it did not happen again. Within 48 hours of the session, 3 separate procedural amendments were submitted to the Council's administrative body. Each one was targeted. The first proposed a new formal restriction on ward species open floor speaking rights, requiring pre-session registration of any intended statement. The second proposed a reclassification of the observer privilege that the archivist held, which would require him to submit all informal conversations with delegations to a review board. The third proposed a new rule requiring co-signature from a full member species for any citation of Article 56. They were all surgical. They were all framed in neutral administrative language. They were all aimed at exactly the things I had used. I read all 3 amendments within an hour of their submission. Then I called the archivist. He arrived at my door within 20 minutes, which for a Korvathi was essentially running. I said, they are going after your observer status. He said, yes. I asked if he was concerned. He said, I have survived 7 attempts to restrict my role in the past 3,000 years. This will be the 8th, he paused. It is the first one that has been submitted within 48 hours of a specific event I was tangentially connected to. They are moving more quickly than they used to. I said, because they are scared. He said, yes. I thought about that. Scared was useful. Scared made people move fast, and moving fast in a system this old and this formal meant moving carelessly. I looked at the 3 amendments again. I looked specifically at their submission timing, all 3 filed within the same 6-hour window. That was unusual. The Council's administrative system had a provision about concurrent submissions from related parties. It was in the procedural manual, not the charter itself, buried in the administrative bylaws that most delegates never read. The provision stated that concurrent submissions addressing the same event from affiliated parties must be bundled into a single submission for administrative processing. The 3 founders who had filed the amendments were affiliated parties under the Council's own affiliation registry. They had filed as separate delegations, but their trade agreements and formal alliance declarations made them a registered bloc. Which meant all 3 amendments had to be bundled. Which meant they could not be fast-tracked individually. Which meant each one required the full deliberative review period, 14 standard days, before any vote could be called. 14 days. That was what I had. I filed a formal bundling notice with the administrative office that afternoon. The clerk, a Vethari administrator who processed paperwork with the automatic efficiency of a species that had been doing bureaucratic work for centuries, looked at my filing, looked at the 3 amendments, looked at my filing again, and then registered it without a word. The founders would know within the hour. I was not trying to stop the amendments. I did not have the votes to stop them. Full member species held those votes, and while I had built relationships with ward species across the station, I had not yet built the kind of deep trust with full members that turned relationships into committed votes. That was a longer project. What I was trying to do was buy 14 days and use them. I spent the first 2 days of those 14 visiting every ward species delegation individually and in person. I told them exactly what the 3 amendments would mean if they passed. I did not exaggerate. I showed them the text and explained the practical effect in simple, clear language. Most of them already understood it better than I did, because they had been living inside this system for far longer. What I asked them was not to fight. I asked them to document. I asked each delegation to submit, through the administrative record system, a formal statement of historical activity, a list of every motion, observation, concern, or request they had attempted to place before the Council in the past 50 years, and what had happened to each one. It was not a protest. It was a record. Under the Charter's transparency provisions, which had been clarified by my Article 22 motion months earlier, those submissions had to be publicly logged within 48 hours. Over the following 5 days, the public administrative record of the Council gained 1,143 separate entries from 12 ward species delegations. The number was not an accident. I had chosen it deliberately. It was the exact page count of the Council Charter. I do not know who noticed first. But it was noticed. On the 6th day, I received a formal invitation to meet with the SOVF elder. The SOVF operated on a different timescale than most of the Council species. A meeting with the SOVF elder was not a meeting in the human sense. It was a structured communication event that required advanced preparation and formal scheduling and would take place over approximately 4 hours of real time, during which the elder would speak slowly and consider each of my responses before answering, because the SOVF elder's cognitive processing happened at a pace calibrated to a lifespan measured in millions of years, and she had not needed to rush a thought in longer than human civilization had existed. I prepared for it for 3 days. The meeting room was cool and dimly lit. The SOVF elder occupied most of it. She was crystalline in the way that certain geological formations are crystalline, not decorative, not delicate, but dense and old and structured by forces that made decoration irrelevant. She refracted the room's light in small shifting patterns across the walls. I found it beautiful in the same way that a fault line is beautiful. You appreciate it while understanding exactly what it means. She spoke first. She said, in the careful translation that the room's system provided, that humanity was an unexpected variable. I said I had heard that before. She said, the amendments we have filed are not personal. I said I knew that. She said, they are necessary for the stability of a system that has maintained peace across 81 species for longer than your planet's current biosphere has existed. I said I understood the weight of that. She said, then you understand why we cannot allow uncontrolled procedural expansion. I said I understood why she believed that. And then I said something that I had not fully planned to say, but which was true, and which came from the same place that my grandmother's levy reports came from, the place where you stop trying to be strategic and just say what is accurate. I said, the system has maintained peace. But peace and justice are not the same thing. The Drell have been on Drell 4 for 80 years under your observation. They were nearly displaced because a filing classified them as absent. That is not a feature of a stable system. That is an error in a system that has grown too confident in its own stability to notice its own errors. The SOVF elder was quiet for a very long time. The refraction patterns on the walls shifted. She said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want the amendments withdrawn." She said, "In exchange for what?" I said, "In exchange for nothing. I am not negotiating a transaction. I am telling you that the amendments, if they pass, will spend the next 100 years being used as examples in every argument about why this council cannot be trusted to govern fairly. I am telling you that the record we have already created, 1143 entries, is public and will remain public. I am telling you that withdrawing the amendments while proposing a genuine working group on ward species integration will be remembered differently than winning a procedural vote." She said, "You are asking us to give something in exchange for nothing concrete." I said, "I am asking you to trade a short-term procedural win for long-term institutional legitimacy. I am asking you to do the thing that is harder and less satisfying and more correct." Another long silence. The light shifted. She said, "You are not what we expected from Earth." I said, "No, but I am very much what Earth actually is." She did not answer. The meeting ended with no formal commitment. I walked back to my quarters and told myself that I did not know which way it would go. 3 days later, the amendments were withdrawn. No explanation was given. They were simply removed from the administrative record, which was technically permissible under the Council's own rules. The withdrawal generated no ceremony, no announcement. It was a quiet reversal. But quiet was not the same as invisible. 17 ward species delegations knew it had happened. The archivist knew it had happened. Gareth Cole, on Earth, received my message about it and called me immediately. He said, "How did you do that?" I said, "I showed them the difference between what they would win and what it would cost them." He said, "Yara, 3 of the 5 founders just backed down." I said, "2 of the 5. The third amendment was from the Vethari, not the SOVF bloc. Yelvatha's delegation." Gareth was quiet. I said, "Yelvatha's amendment is still active." Gareth said, "So it is not over." I said, "It is never over. That is the point. This is not a problem you solve. This is a system you maintain. You keep reading it, you keep finding the errors, you keep putting them on record. That is the work." I hung up. I looked at my notes. I had 6 motions left. I had 12 days before the next full session. I had a ward species coalition that had now publicly documented its history and was waiting to see what would happen next. And I had 14 months of experience inside a station that had spent 6,000 years assuming that no one in the outer ring would ever do anything this consistent. I picked up my pen. 6 years is a long time and no time at all. I know that sounds like the kind of thing people say when they have been away from home long enough to lose the thread of ordinary measurement, but what I mean is something more specific. 6 years is long enough to watch something change. It is short enough to remember, clearly and without sentimentality, the exact moment you arrived. I remember the platform. I remember the cold. I remember Coordinator Yelvatha's 4 eyes and the word he chose, charmingly reactive, and the way I made myself take a breath before answering. It is 6 years later. I am no longer ambassador-elect. I am senior ambassador of the human delegation, and the human delegation now occupies a seat 17 positions closer to the center of the chamber than when I arrived. This is a concrete thing. It is a matter of administrative record. The chair has a name placard that the station's facility staff installed without being asked, which means someone requested it through the appropriate channels, and I do not know who, and I have decided not to find out because some things are better left as gifts. The council looks different than it did when I arrived. Not different in its structure, the 5 founders still sit elevated in the center, the same ceremonial protocols still govern every session, the charter is still 1140 pages long. But something in the quality of the room has changed. There is more noise in it now. Not disorder, noise in the sense of more voices contributing to the space, more presences that occupy the chamber with the particular weight of something that has decided it belongs. 11 ward species now hold provisional speaking rights. 3 of those are actively petitioning for full member review. The Drell are still on Drell 4. Their classification was formally corrected 2 years after I first raised it, following a review process that took longer than it should have and produced a result that was more correct than it had any right to be, given the forces that had worked against it. I consider that a reasonable outcome. I have learned to consider reasonable outcomes as victories rather than waiting for perfect ones. The archivist is still in the records hall. His observer status was never successfully restricted, though 3 more attempts were made in the years following the first. Each attempt was countered using procedural provisions from the charter itself, which the archivist knew better than anyone who had tried to limit him. I visit him twice a week. He tells me things. I write them down. Coordinator Yelvath was promoted 2 years ago to Primary Council Secretary, which is the most senior administrative role in the station outside of the founder positions. He requested that the human delegation be informed directly of his promotion before the general announcement was made. I do not know what to make of that entirely, but I think about it sometimes. I think there is something in it that is not quite friendship but is also not quite not friendship. We have learned to work in the same space. We have learned to be honest with each other in the way that 2 people can be honest when they have been on opposite sides of enough arguments to have genuine respect for each other's intelligence. Delegate Pell of the Anari was the first ward species representative to formally petition for full member status. The petition has been in review for 16 months. The review process is slower than it should be, which is also a reasonable summary of most things in this institution. Pell sends me messages periodically that are phrased as updates but function as check-ins, making sure I am still reading the filings, still watching the administrative board each morning. I am. I always am. The SOVF elder and I have met 4 more times since our first conversation. Our meetings are still long, still slow, still conducted in that cool room with the shifting light. We do not agree on most things. We agree that we are both trying to maintain something functional, and that maintaining something functional sometimes requires admitting that it has failed and doing the work to correct the failure. This is, in my experience, a greater point of agreement than it sounds. Most institutions cannot manage even that. The cycle's formal name addition ceremony was scheduled for this session. The tradition, older than any living member species' diplomatic memory, required each new full member to add 1 word to the council's official name. The name had grown over thousands of years. The Imperial Galactic Overwatch Council of the known universe was 37 words in its current full form, each word added by a species upon achieving full membership, each word a statement of what that species believed the council represented or aspired to. I had been thinking about our word for a long time. The chamber was full. All 81 delegations. The founders in the center. The ward species in the outer ring, several of them now standing where they once would have sat in silence. The archivist was present in his observer capacity at the edge of the floor. Gareth Cole, who had finally been given a visitor's pass after 9 years of liaison work, was sitting in the human delegation support area with an expression that looked exactly like someone trying very hard not to cry at a government function. The voice of Origins called for the name submission. I walked to the floor's center platform. It was the first time I had stood there. It was designed for species larger than me, and I was aware, as I stood on it, that I was smaller than the space expected. I have spent 6 years being smaller than space is expected. It stopped bothering me a while ago. I held the submission card that the ceremony required. On it was the word we had chosen. I said, the human delegation submits the following word for addition to the council's name, in accordance with the traditions of membership and in recognition of the council's stated aspirations as written in the preamble of the charter. I read the word. Accountable. The chamber was very quiet. Then a sound began, something that my earpiece could not translate cleanly into English because it was not language. It was a sound that 81 different species make when they are processing something unexpected, and all of those different sounds happening simultaneously in a space that size created something that was not quite a word and not quite a reaction but was both at the same time. The voice of Origins looked at me. The SOVF elder looked at me. Her facets shifted, a pattern I had learned to read over 4 meetings. It was not displeasure this time. It was the crystalline equivalent of something landing somewhere real. Yelvath, in his new position as Primary Council Secretary, read the submission into the formal record. His voice was steady and careful and precise, and I thought I caught, briefly, at the edge of his intonation, something that was not quite approval but was adjacent to it. The word was accepted. It was added to the name. The Imperial Galactic Overwatch Council of the Known Universe, accountable. Delegate Pell's skin shifted to a color I had not seen before, a warm copper gold that my notes told me appeared only in moments of what the Anari considered deep recognition. The Harith delegates' fins moved in a rapid pattern that I had been told was their version of applause. The Phi representatives, slow and ancient and patient in the way of things that have outlasted every argument about whether they belong, were still. But there was something in their stillness that was not emptiness. There was the quality of something resting after a long walk. Gareth, in the support area, was not trying very hard anymore. After the ceremony, I walked back to my quarters through the station's corridor system. The corridor was the same pale smooth material it had always been. The light was the same blue-white. I passed the spot where I had sat on the floor with my ration packet on my 22nd day, reading procedural countermanuals. I sat down in that spot. Not because I was tired. Because I wanted to remember what it had felt like to sit there then, knowing nothing and having found everything and being completely unsure whether any of it would work. I wanted to compare that feeling to what I felt now. What I felt now was not triumph. Triumph is a feeling with an ending point. What I felt was something without a clear end, something that extended forward into the next session and the session after that, into Pell's pending membership petition and the Drell reclassification review and the 6 remaining ward species who had not yet submitted their historical documentation because they were not certain it was safe to. It extended backward, too. To my grandmother's levy. To Gareth's 9 years of working on the outside of a door that would not open. To the Methe, whoever they had been, 6,000 years ago, who had read the charter and asked too many questions in the wrong rooms. They had not been wrong, the archivist had said. They had simply not been careful. I had been careful. I had been patient in the specific, directed way that is not passivity but is instead attention focused across a longer timeline than the situation wants to allow. I had been every kind of stubborn that does not look like stubbornness from the outside, because the outside was watching for noise and I had made almost none. I sat in the corridor for a while. Then I went inside my quarters, which now had furniture at approximately the right height, because I had filed a facilities request in my 3rd week on the station and it had taken 8 months to be processed and completed, which was also a reasonable summary of how this place worked. I opened my notebook. Not the one from 6 years ago, I was on the 11th notebook now. I opened it to a blank page. I had been asked by Earth's diplomatic bureau to write a guide. A practical document for the next human ambassador who would come after me, eventually, when my term ended or when something else changed the shape of things. The Bureau wanted strategy. It wanted procedural knowledge. It wanted an account of what had worked and what had not. I was going to give them all of that. But I had decided that I was going to begin with something that was not strategy. I wrote. The charter is 1140 pages long. Read every word of it before your first session. Not because it will tell you what to do. Because it will tell you the shape of what you are dealing with. Every system this old has been written by people who believed in it. That belief leaves traces. And inside those traces, if you are patient and specific and willing to spend a very long night with very bad coffee, you will find the places where the belief and the reality have come apart. I stopped. Then I wrote. This is not cynicism. Cynicism says the gap is proof that nothing works. What I am saying is different. The gap is where the work is. The gap is information. The gap is where you start. I paused again. I thought about all 17 species who had stood up in that first extraordinary session. I thought about Pell's copper gold. I thought about the Phi delegate who had said, in their ancient slow voice, that they had been waiting for someone to ask. I wrote. Do not walk past the outer ring on your way to the center. The people in the outer ring have been reading the same charter for longer than you have. They know where the gaps are. They have been waiting for someone who would read the document and then actually look up from it. Look up. Look around. Learn their names. Learn their food customs. Learn 6 words of their language, correctly, without making a production of it. You are not there to save them. You are there to work with them. There is a very large difference between those two things, and if you understand that difference before your first session, you will already be ahead of where I was. I looked at what I had written. Then I added. And when they ask you for the word you will add to the name, take your time with it. Choose something true. Choose something the council needs to be reminded of, not something that flatters the species that chose it. You are adding to a document that is already longer than it should be. Make your word count. I closed the notebook. Through the narrow viewport in my quarters, the stars were the same stars they had always been, indifferent, ancient, scattered across a darkness that made the station look very small from the outside, if anyone out there was looking. Inside the station, 1,143 historical records were sitting in the public administrative system. A copper-gold delegate was waiting for a membership petition to clear review. An ancient crystalline elder was considering, slowly, what it meant to have the word accountable added to her institution's name. And somewhere in the records hall, the archivist was tending to 6,000 years of history, and occasionally, when observation led to conversation, making sure the right things got said at the right time. I turned off my light. I lay down on a sleeping platform that was finally at the right height. I closed my eyes. Tomorrow the council would convene again. I would be there. I would be reading. I would be watching the administrative filing board, because there were always new filings, new gaps, new places where the belief and the reality had come apart and needed someone to find them. I had one motion left in the notebook I had started on my first night. I had worked through all the others across 6 years. The last one had no date on it. I had been saving it. I had a feeling I would know when the time was right. I fell asleep in a station the size of a moon, in the outer ring of a galaxy that had not expected us, and I thought, in the last half-second before sleep arrived, that we had been charmingly reactive after all. Just not in the way they had meant.